In this module, we will talk about how to add JavaScript code to our web page. There are three key ways to add JavaScript code to our web page. The first is internal JavaScript. The second is external JavaScript. And the third is inline JavaScript. Let's go ahead and examine each one. So internal JavaScript is when we add JavaScript code to our HTML file within script tags. We did this in our JavaScript label example, and we added JavaScript code using the script tag and the close script tag. And this is essentially a very popular way of adding JavaScript code in an HTML file. Next up, let's look at external JavaScript. External JavaScript is simply referencing JavaScript code from an external file. This method is great for a number of reasons. It's great for readability. So if we have HTML code in one file and have JavaScript code in another file, what this means is our HTML file becomes a lot easier to read, and it's not dirtied with JavaScript code and HTML file and CSS tags and the whole lot. It's also great for organizing code. And finally, it's really useful if we want to reuse JavaScript code across multiple HTML files. If we had a piece of JavaScript code that was necessary for different HTML files in our project, the sensible thing and the most efficient thing to do is to have that JavaScript code in a separate file and then have all the multiple HTML files that need that code, just reference it from there. This method is really similar to using external style sheets. You know that with CSS you can define styles within your HTML file, or you can decide to put all your styles in a separate CSS file and just reference it from your HTML file. So the same way we can reference external style sheets, we can also reference external JavaScript from our HTML file. So let's rework our JavaScript label example to see how external JavaScript works. Okay, so just to reiterate, we will be removing the JavaScript code from our HTML file, put that in an external file, reference that external file, and test to see that our web page still does the same thing it did when we had the JavaScript in the HTML file. So the first thing I will do is to launch Visual Studio Code. If you don't have it open already, so please go ahead and launch that. Then next thing I will do is open my index.html file. That can be found in the JavaScript label folder. And then we will delete the entire script and JavaScript code within those script tags and possibly paste that in a text file so we can reference that later. Okay, now that I've got my index.html file open, I'm going to go into where the script tag is and JavaScript code. I'm going to remove that and paste that in a text file so that I can access it later. Okay, then the next thing I'm going to do is to save the file, and then we can test our HTML to see that the JavaScript code is gone and our label isn't interactive anymore. Okay, so I would save. Then I can go into my folder, double click on the index.html. So the label is there, but when I click on it, nothing happens. And that is to be expected because we have removed the JavaScript code from the HTML file. Now that's done, it's time to now put our JavaScript into a new file. So let's go into Visual Studio Code and create a new file. Let's paste the JavaScript code that was removed and let's place it into that new file. And then we can save the file as scripts.js in the JavaScript label. So yeah, that is script.js. And it's important to ensure the file has a .js extension so that the system can recognize it as a JavaScript file. All right, so back in Visual Studio Code, let me create a new file. Then let me go into my text file and copy just the JavaScript code. And then I'll paste it in this new file. Let me format that just a little bit. Okay. And then I'll save it as script.js in my JavaScript label folder. So you see that Visual Studio Code, as soon as it recognizes that I've saved it as a .js extension, highlights some of the keywords, some of the JavaScript keywords. Now it's important to note here that I didn't copy this script tag and the end script tag in here. That's because that's only needed when we are, using internal JavaScript. When we are creating an external file to hold JavaScript, we don't use the script tags. We essentially just put the JavaScript code in directly. Okay, so at this point, we have our external JavaScript file. We have our HTML file. Now we need to just reference the external JavaScript file from our HTML file. To do that, we use the convention script src equals the file name.js. In this instance, it will be script.js and then the closing script tag. And the value of the src, or the source key, like it's called, is really the relative path to the external JavaScript file. Once we've done that, we will save the file. We will save our index.html file, and then we'll test to see that our label is now interactive again. Okay, now I'm back in my index.html file. So as we said, I would add a script source equals script.js, and Visual Studio automatically adds the closing script for me. And that's it really. So now what I've done is to tell the file to grab all the JavaScript code from this scripts.js file. So I can save, and now if I go back into my index.html and I test, I can see my pop-up has come up again. And so that is really the way we can use external JavaScript in our HTML file. Okay, the last method of adding JavaScript to your web page we are going to look at today is inline JavaScript. This is embedding JavaScript code within HTML elements. I'm sure now you're thinking, what's the difference between this and internal JavaScript? So the difference is that with internal JavaScript, your JavaScript code is always situated within script tags. But with inline JavaScript, your JavaScript can be actually part of the HTML elements and code. However, this is not an advised method of adding JavaScript to a web page. It is usually advised to use either internal JavaScript or external JavaScript, or a combination of both. It's just good to be able to separate your code from the HTML element in itself. Let's look at an example of inline JavaScript by reworking our JavaScript label to use inline JavaScript instead of the external JavaScript we used in the previous example. Okay, so in this example, we will be removing all references to our external JavaScript from our HTML file, and we will replace that with inline JavaScript. So the first thing we're going to do is open up our index.html file if you don't have it open already. And then we're going to update the paragraph tag to include an onClick attribute that has a value of update name. Like I said earlier, please don't worry if you don't understand the code as of now, or if you don't understand the JavaScript concept as of now. We haven't touched on some of these things. We're just looking at the different ways of adding JavaScript to a web page. So now that I'm back in my index.html file, the first thing I'm going to do is to remove the script reference to the external JavaScript file, since we won't be needing that anymore for this example. Okay, then as stated in the instruction, I'm going to add an attribute to my paragraph tag here, and it's going to be an onClick attribute, and the value is going to be update name with the opening and close bracket. That essentially is saying if anyone clicks on this paragraph tag, then this is a function you should call. Okay, now that's done. Next thing to do is to open up our script.js file, and then we will copy the first line of code and also the entire update name function block from that file. Once we've copied the code, then we will paste all that code into our index.html file, and we will place that code within script tags. Okay, so now that I've opened my script.js file, the plan is for me to copy the first line of code here and this whole function update name block. We haven't covered functions yet, but we will cover it at a later stage. But for now, just know functions is just a collection of or a few lines of JavaScript code. The easiest thing for me to do now is probably just to copy everything and delete the line which I don't need once I've copied it over. Okay, so I'm back in my index.html file. I'm going to create a script tag here, and then I'm going to paste my code and delete the line we don't need. The reason why we're deleting this line is because it's doing the same thing as this onClick attribute, essentially telling the browser to respond to the user's click. Okay, so after a bit of formatting, I think it's all ready and done. And yes, so just to give you a bit of update on what this code does, remember, don't worry if you don't understand what's going on right now. So we've put an onClick attribute here on our paragraph tab. This onClick attribute essentially tells JavaScript that, tells the browser that whenever a user clicks on this paragraph tag, invoke this function called update name, and this is the update name function here. And what that does, it brings up the pop-up box, tells the user to enter a new name, and then it updates the paragraph with the new name the user has entered. So let's see how it runs. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is to save our file, and then we will go into the JavaScript label folder, double click on our index.html file, and we will test to see if our label is working. All right, so save. Then let's go to our folder, double click on the index.html. So our label is here, and if I click on it, aha, the pop-up shows. So I can put in my name, and yes, you can see it changes. So our inline JavaScript also works the same way as our internal JavaScript has worked, and also work the same way as the external JavaScript has worked. Okay, before we wrap up this segment of this module, let me quickly say some final words on adding JavaScript to a web page. So although we did cover adding JavaScript inline, it is actually considered bad practice to do so. So please do try and avoid using inline JavaScript as much as you can. Apart from it being bad practice, it is also actually very inefficient, and it is an inefficient way of doing things. You can still achieve the same objectives by adding JavaScript internally or externally. And finally, it's possible to use a mixture of external, internal, and inline JavaScript all in the same file. And you can choose which one or which combination of these methods work for your objectives. So that brings this segment to an end. In the next lesson, we will be looking at using comments in JavaScript code.